Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Events Horizon. So, since we last got together, Darren, I know that you conducted a retreat in Idaho. You want to tell us a little bit about what happened?
Sure, it was a really amazing experience with a great group of people. As many people know, I have taught this class a couple different times over the last year or so. Did it once last fall and once again really this winter going into the spring. And this retreat was made up of people who've taken that class, basically that online class. So we kind of knew each other in an online kind of way, virtual way. But it was really great to see people in person in such a really beautiful location in Idaho, facing the Wyoming section with the Grand Tetons and whatnot. So amazing scenery. We had great weather while we were there and just had a wonderful experience together. Even saw some things at night in terms of UAP, things we noticed, these flashbulb UAP. So it was altogether a really profound experience. We were already talking about it, doing it next year again. And yeah, it was everything I was hoping for and more, as they say.
Well, that's awesome. And then you're headed to Europe, I hear.
I am doing that too, which is also great because as I was saying to you privately, I started this little podcast a few years ago and then realized now I have these friends that I know about and some that I don't know about all around the planet now. And so when I announced today that I was planning to go to Europe in the fall, in November, all these people reached out to me, started arranging for things for me to speak at, to connect with people and whatnot. So that was a really profound experience too. And I'm really looking forward to having more Idaho experience, but this time in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe.
Awesome. All right. Well, I look forward to you telling us what happens when you get back from the trip. So you ready to kick off for today?
I am. Let's do it.
All right. So today the goal is to talk about the indications and implications of what it would be like to live in a non-physical reality, which we call idealism. So this extends what we didn't get to last episode, and it begins to apply to a larger world that we all live in, individually and collectively, and that's what makes it really interesting and fun. So I think you were going to kick us off with the hard problem of consciousness and how it relates to the nature of reality.
That's right. So we talked about that in passing in the last episode, but didn't really get into it. But this is really the crux of the matter in many ways in terms of science and what it has wrestled with in terms of trying to unwrap the nature of reality. Within the sciences, this has been the one biggest challenge. And it is kind of ironic because it's not a small potato, because this is really asking questions around how is it that we have conscious experiences at all? How is it that we are aware of what goes on in our lives? And of course, the irony there is that were we not aware, we would have no sciences. We would be doing no inquiry because we would have no awareness of the fact that we seem to be awake and having experiences. So what specifically is the hard problem of consciousness? This was a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers and refers to the difficulty in explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences, also known as qualia. While neuroscience can describe the mechanisms behind brain function and behavior, it struggles to explain why these processes are accompanied by conscious experience. The problem is quote-unquote hard because it goes beyond the easy problems of consciousness, which involve explaining cognitive functions and behaviors through neural activity. We've done some of that. The easy problems include understanding how the brain processes information, makes decisions, and controls behavior. These can be addressed through empirical research and functional explanations. In contrast, however, the hard problem addresses the question of why certain brain processes are accompanied by an inner subjective experience. For example, why does the activity in our visual cortex lead to the experience of seeing the color red rather than being a non-conscious process? This involves bridging the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience, a challenge that remains unresolved and is central to the debate in philosophy about mind and consciousness studies. So this is the issue. How is it that we're awake and apparently having conscious experience? There's nothing in the brain itself that says why that would happen. And one of the chief proponents of a different notion of reality based on consciousness, which is the one that we both adopt based again on our personal experience and what we've seen empirically, is Donald Hoffman. Now he talks about the hard problem of consciousness like this. He says, quote, "The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how we have qualia or phenomenal experiences, how sensations acquire characteristics such as colors and tastes." He also goes on to say, When you taste a piece of chocolate, you have a certain experience. This experience is a conscious experience, a qualia. The problem for science is to explain why this taste of chocolate feels the way it does and why it has this particular subjective character, unquote. Last thing I want to say before I pass it on to you is that Hoffman really makes this point that we can't cut corners here, that if we're going to say we want empirical evidence, and if we're trying to claim that brain processes, in other words, physical structures in the brain, explain and produce consciousness, then we should be able to at least look at one of these things, like the color red, the taste of chocolate, the smell of a rose, and show where in the brain that's firing and what way so as to produce that. And yet we haven't been able to do that for a single qualia, for a single conscious experience. So really, this is a massive gap. And we have kind of this promissory note from physicalists saying, we'll get there one day. But again, David Chalmers had someone else he made a sort of bet with about this, right? I think you know something about this, back in the 90s. And we have not had any evidence since then produced to suggest that brain processes and structures, physicality gives rise to consciousness. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I do remember the push in science, because I was on a campus in an academic center in the early 2000s to really be able to solve this problem, right? So there were lots of universities, including the one I was in, getting magnets, the big MRI machines, so that they could figure out exactly where it was. And one of the reasons why it was that bet you were talking about happened in 1994 between philosopher Chalmers and neuroscience Christoph Koch, right? And they made a bet. Koch said within 25 years, science would have found the seed of consciousness in the brain, and Chalmers said no. And that bet turned to this year, 2024, and Koch conceded the bet, basically. He said, so Koch is the neuroscientist. They have not found the seed of consciousness. He's still holding out that they will, but he had to confess that he lost the bet. The prediction was won. So, yeah, I mean, I think both of us would assume that they're never going to find the seed of consciousness, but we'll probably find lots of signatures for the processes in the brain. And so that is kind of the direction that things have gone. If the question is like, what do we know about brain research that would suggest evidence for quantum processes as opposed to material processes, there is starting to be not an insignificant body of research. So it tends to revolve around sort of two dominant theories related to quantum information processing. So the idea that brain processes information at the quantum level, and it would accommodate and explain the hugely complex kinds of material stimulus that humans can manage at any given time. And then also what's called the orchestrated objective reduction theory. And this is the primary Penrose-Hamroth model that is talked about the most, which suggests that consciousness arises from quantum processes occurring within microtubules within the brain. So that's cool because that gives us a place to go to really start doing really deep hypothetical testing. And I think there's some preliminary suggestion to support both these theories. And you do see science is already fairly well documented that quantum processes occur in, say, like photosynthesis. The ways that plants take the sun and make energy out of it is a form of quantum coherence. And also some of my favorite places to go to look for this stuff is like birds, avian magnetoreception, which is the idea that birds have cryptochrome proteins that detect the Earth's magnetic field, and that the way that the Earth's magnetic field interacts with various properties in the bird's brain are fundamental quantum, the way that they interact, that allow the bird to instantaneously detect where it should be going based on information coming in from magnets, basically the magnetism of the Earth. So it's really, really fascinating. And the other one I know that everybody's probably seen, even if you haven't realized that there are some quantum principles to it, is murmuration. When birds fly and starlings that can it's amazing to watch what they do. Well, some of it can be explained by fixed classical processes, but there are parts of what they do in terms of the fluidity, the speed, the way they stay sort of constantly balanced. It's like total chaos and total elegant beauty. Some of those features of murmuration are not at all explained by fixed models, and we really have to rely on quantum physicists to explain it. And you even see it in human brains, too, because we see that the humans have magnetite in the brain, which is involved in spatial orientation and susceptible to quantum effects. We know that microtubules can conduct electricity and probably play a role in information processing in neurons related to quantum vibrations in the microtubules. And even DNA mutations, apparently, this is something I just learned, mutations and replication may happen through proton tunneling. There's a lot of small examples that are really, really fascinating and do support the fundamental theories that we've been talking about.
Right. And so just so we can bridge for people a bit of our last conversation in the last episode with this one, we're saying that when you start looking at quantum processes as the core of reality, you kind of are getting to metaphysical territory, because we're talking about the way that the observer, the participant mind itself seems to change or orient or shape the manifestation of physical reality. So when we're seeing quantum processes happening in the human brain, we're seeing that, like you said, with flocks of birds in terms of how they navigate and things like that. We're seeing evidence of this. And again, so on one level, it looks like different minds being channeled into different brains, having experiences as individuals. We would again argue that you can look at it from a more macro view and see that these are all manifestations of the same fundamental thing, all the same thing, basically, fundamentally at the end of the day. So a couple of things here. One is that, again, idealism posits that mind or consciousness is fundamental, and that's what we're seeing here. But we do look at things like brain structures, and when certain people have experiences, certain parts of the brain sometimes do light up. So we might have some people out there saying, wait a second, I know that I've seen examples where the brain lights up when you have an experience. Doesn't that prove that the locus of that experience is in the physical brain? And I think what we would say, and what other idealists would say, like Bernardo Kastrup, for instance, is that there's correlations where at this fundamental mind level, things are happening, and you will see that registered in physical structures of the brain. But that doesn't mean that the locus or the origination is there. We're seeing more correlation rather than causation. And again, for decades now, physicalists have assumed that it's causation, and they've been trying to find evidence. And again, going back to what you pointed to earlier in terms of that bet that was had, they have found none. They are really no closer at all. It's not like they're slowly getting there. They have made no progress since the 90s in terms of that model.
No, and I mean, if anything, it's probably, I mean, I can't speak for neuroscientists. I'm sure that they would vehemently disagree about some of this, but I do think it's interesting that some of the experiments we referenced before, in which we see that brain physiology as well as other physiologies as registered in the body, are often responding just a little bit before the stimulus actually comes. I think that becomes impossible to explain by any kind of standard model. You have to lean on non-standard models. And then the other, which I know we'll dive into at some point, the effects of psychedelics on the brain and the ways that those work are completely different than neuroscience, standard neuroscience suggest.
Right, and we are going to get into that. One thing I want to say before we transition to our next question here is the fact that, pointing to what you're getting at there, with the sense that we actually perceive things a second before they happen or a microsecond before they happen. Not only is that the case, but we also see evidence that we perceive it in our body, and then we cerebrally think about it, we justify, we rationalize. But this happens so quickly, and we've been so propagandized into thinking that our brain is producing our conscious experience that we think we're making decisions and perceiving through our brains, right? We're actually not. We're actually doing that after the fact. That's what's so fascinating, because now we have measurements that are so precise. We can actually look at this and go, wait a second, like we said last time, this person's skin conduction, their eyes, their pulse, all of that is giving signs that they're having an experience before we even have a chance for it to get to the brain. The brain, after the fact, kind of puts it through this process. And we sometimes are fooled ourselves into thinking, I made such and such a decision because of these rational reasons, these pros and cons. But actually, when you really look at it closely, people are actually making gut instinct decisions. And what do we mean by that? We mean something that's not really just a simple linear pro and con kind of list. And you point to, in the first episode, to that friend of yours you see do this, and she seems oblivious to the fact that she does it. This was so fascinating. We do operate this way as humans, but it's because we've been so propagandized into this physicalist mindset that we have fooled ourselves into thinking we're doing something we're actually not.
She doesn't just not see it. She actively angry. And I point out, when I say, how'd you do that? How did you just do that right there? She's like, do what? I think that gets into a whole other area, not for today, but related to why. Why have humans been so programmed? Part of it is certainly just we have this assumption about the way the world works, and it's really materially based, and that's nice and simple and easy, and we inherit it. But it doesn't always explain why people get angry or irritable or shun. We should be curious, especially when it's coming out of credible places and with interesting experiences. That part is kind of interesting to me. Like, what happened to us?
Right, and when we walk into a room and we find our mood being changed in some way, and we realize, you and I anyway, that this is because we're picking up on the energy of other people, and we have these porous boundaries between ourselves, and that's why we can actually be impacted and changed by other people we're around. I've been close to some empaths who I literally see almost like they change personalities depending on who they're around and which room they walk into. And again, according to the physicalist model and this idea that everything that you experience as you and as anything you can qualitatively point to, all is produced and held within the skull, then how does that happen? We see all sorts of evidence, and I think any of us who are really in touch with the way we experience the world and other people know that we pick up energies all over the place.
Yeah, love is another one. I mean, right? Like, I can talk to the most diehard scientist, they'll talk about their partner or whatever, and the assumption is, I don't know, we just fell in love. How did that happen? Why that person? We make a lot of space in our world for experiences like love or things that are just, they're impossible to place in the materialist paradigm. It's just kind of over there. It's just that over there pile of things that are fascinating and unexplainable is just getting really, really big.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our next question now, which is as follows. Assuming the non-material reality is a more accurate rendering of reality, what are some of the indicators and implications? So we brought this up in the beginning. We want to look at both indicators that are pointing in this direction that consciousness is primary, or that the idealistic way of seeing the world is the most tenable. And we also want to look at some of the implications of that. If that's the case, what does that mean? So the first one is time perception oddities. Now, we, I think, are all aware that our experience of time is quite subjective. We all know that when you're having fun, time flies, as the expression goes. And when you're laboriously working at something that's not very cognitively interesting, it can feel like it's dragging. We talk about this all the time. Of course, we assume that there actually is an objective fixed time, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And again, this is one of those examples again where we've been sort of bludgeoned into thinking time is a fixed thing that is measurable and is precise, but that doesn't seem to be the case. What do you think about time?
I was thinking about a study that was done. It came out earlier this year, I think, from some scholars at Cornell that found that our perception of time is linked to the intervals between heartbeats. I believe I have that correct. I may have it slightly incorrect, but it has something to do with our heartbeats. And that the subjective experience of it is linked to our own subjective physical experience of our heartbeats. I find that fascinating. There's been a number of other studies since then that basically converge on this idea that time is just a construct. It's not concrete. There is no objective measure of time. And of course, as you know, that's a central component of all quantum mechanics.
One other thing I think about in terms of time, this relates again to our last episode when we talked about all these different streams of data that are pointing in this direction, pointing towards idealism or consciousness being fundamental, is what all of our ancient spiritual traditions have said about this, that basically this is part of the illusion, that space-time itself is part of Maya, part of the illusion, right? So we have those saying that. And again, just like I pointed out last time, the non-human intelligences that people have contacted over time say the very same thing, that basically this is just a construct, a human construct, pointing specifically, I think, to what you even talked about there, like part of our physiological process. Last thing I'll point out, too, is I've just been reading today this book on near-death experiences, part of Jeffrey Long's work. And he makes this point as well, is that when people have this experience of going to some other place, when their brain is flatlining, they should be having no conscious experience, but they are. And while they're in this place, things seem to roll out very differently. They don't experience time. It's not just that they say time flows differently, but they don't even really experience time. And that gets tricky for us to understand because we're used to it being here. But again, this is part of the construct, not something fundamental to reality.
For people who do follow the more spiritually minded folks out there who are engaging with all this, there is some sense that time is actually doing something odd at the moment. So I know lots of us are feeling time oddities. Like it's usually it's like super fast. Sometimes an event will go by and I'll be like, God, it feels like it was a month ago and it was 2 days ago. Time does feel distorted and warped. And those folks are saying it's because it is. And it has to do with all sorts of things that are going on outside of our immediate spheres.
That's a great point. And I just want to highlight what you just said there for everyone else. It's not just that we individually experience time differently in different occasions, but that literally as a collective, we experience it differently. And I've absolutely heard the very same thing you're talking about, where people as a group, as a collective, are beginning to feel like time is flowing differently. And that would make sense, because if this is all one, right, if this is all part of an expression of some underlying source, then when it begins to go into a different kind of modulation, you would see implications in all sorts of areas, including our perception of time, not just as individuals, but as a collective. All right, many examples of time oddities there. Now let's jump into synchronicities. Take it away, Janis.
All right. So synchronicity is a concept, as far as I can tell, that was introduced by Carl Jung in the 1920s. And he elaborates it a little bit later in 1952, and then some other theorists jump in a little bit later than that. But it basically describes meaningful coincidences that appear highly significant despite lacking a clear causal relationship. So this is another thing. Time seems to be doing funny things for people, but I know you talked about this recently on Liminal Frames, your own experience recently with synchronicities, but everybody I know is having massive synchronicities. They're just like in hyperdrive. So, it can be as small as seeing numbers, strings of numbers, 111, 222, 323. I swear that happens to me so many times a day. It's annoying. I roll my eyes. I'm like, if you're trying to tell me something, then just get to the point, because I don't really want to go have to figure out what these mean. But even more is like thought, the most common is like you might think something and then an event occurs. Somebody calls, or you see whatever you were thinking on the side of a truck, or you had a question, you go to the grocery store, somebody standing in line basically answers it, even though they have no idea that's what they're doing. Or you have something that you need and it shows up, or something that you're desiring, right? So I think at this point, everybody I know has had those in their life, and it seems like those are getting to be more common. And then I think there's really complex synchronicities, which are cross-time events where your life interweaves with somebody in an odd way. Like an old partner of mine is in Nepal, and he's looking for somebody to give some black market stuff to him before he gets on the plane, because he doesn't need to take it with him, right? Some whiskey and stuff that you can trade. And off the plane gets an old friend from school. And he just gives it to him. And then that person shows up again somewhere else, several years later. Those interesting crisscrosses have become sort of a feature of some of the communities that I'm in, because they're becoming so common, and it's becoming very difficult to ignore that they exist. So there definitely seems to be patterned. There's some geometry to it. And, now that we have the idealist landscape to kind of play around in, the stuff that we see with synchronicity certainly fits there much more than it fits a materialist model, which would basically say it's absolutely coincidental. But it's so frequent, at least in my own life, it's like it's absolutely not coincidental. There's just no way on this planet. There's all these fascinating things. But I know you also have studied this a lot and had a lot of experiences. So what do you think?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that, as we mentioned in the first podcast episode, you and I both are robust critical thinkers. We are analytical thinkers, and we don't just quickly assume this is the case because it sounds more fun and sounds kind of magical. We have kind of been bludgeoned into believing this is the case because it's been so repetitive in our lives in ways that basically add up to what I call preposterosity. I literally coined a term to describe this because it's so insane. And it's like something's really trying to get your attention. And if it doesn't get your attention the first 19 times, it will keep trying until it does. I've often found that to be the case. Although there is a part I want to bring up later about this relational aspect. But absolutely, and you also pointed to it happening in communities. I have absolutely found that when I, for instance, was teaching these classes, these expanding awareness classes, we began to notice synchronicities happening amongst the group. So I would come in wanting to talk about a certain synchronicity that happened to me individually, and then in the group it would start popping up, and even things that happened before the group even started. So it's like our lives were already being aligned somehow beforehand. Really fascinating. And speaking of thinking about it as a coincidence versus a synchronicity, I really want to recommend this book called The Source and Significance of Coincidences, which is by Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett. This is an amazing book. This is probably a book I would recommend more than any other right now. I just find it so compelling because there's so much data. Again, she began as a physicalist and an atheist, and she was driven to this perspective of there being this meaning-making aspect to reality that is fundamental only by seeing the hard data and being persuaded by the hard data. And she sort of goes through that process here and gives so many examples of this. You just really can't argue with it. There's this meaning-making fundamental core to reality, and it's relational, especially when we act on a real sense of essential energy, because again, it's all one. So as one acts in a certain way, it's going to impact everything else, especially when we're acting in ways that really are driven by deep emotional resonance. I have found, and this is talked about in this book as well, that specifically deeply emotional events become even more synchronistic. That seems to be somehow at the core of reality.
Yeah. I suspect it's all geometry. So there's a way, I mean, we've talked about fractal. It's like Tetris. I think it is like you take it, you rotate it, you turn it upside down, and then it looks different, it feels different, but it's a presentation of the same underlying mechanism, but fractaled. I think there's strongly mathematical and geometric components to a lot of the way that the formless, then that which has no form, becomes form when we're moving across quantum phenomena, basically. Like, how does something quantum formless in waveform drop in? One of the places that I noticed synchronicity showing up in my world was when I was studying and teaching about Albert Bandura's concept of fortuitous events, when I was talking about human development and human agency in particular. It's another question. How do we really have agency? But he has in this pivotal document, it's one of the, foundational documents in developmental science. He talks about the role of fortuitous events, which I think are just synchronicities in lives. Like, there's stuff that we can see depending on where you were born, who you were born to. Like, there's just certain kinds of factors that do weigh a lot in people's life trajectories. And there's other things we can model, but there's this huge bucket we can't, that's called fortuitous events. It's the random things that happen. They're life-changing, but they're super common. Like, people, over 50% of people in the studies will say they met their partner, that they married and had children with, in a completely random way, or seemingly random way, right? Or their career. 70% of people will say that their careers was a fortuitous event. So anyway, I think that's synchronicity too, at work and evident in sort of a design of human life.
I have one more example of synchronicity. I thought of this because of something you mentioned a bit earlier. This was really bizarre when this happened. And at the time it happened, I wasn't really thinking about synchronicities in the way that I am now. I wasn't sort of having my eye out for them. At that time, it just seemed really, really bizarre to me. In 2018, I moved from California to North Carolina. I moved from Sacramento area to where I was living in Asheville. And I had been part of the integral community in Sacramento, kind of a leader there. And I had had a falling out with this one particular person in co-leadership with me, and it just didn't end so well, basically. I didn't have hard feelings, but I could tell that he kind of did, and there were some things we need to kind of work through. And I remember thinking, while I was walking around in Asheville after I had moved, that was unfortunate. That's the one piece I wish had kind of landed differently, even though at the time I wasn't quite sure how to navigate that. And as I was thinking about this, I kid you not, across the street manifested this very person that I knew in Sacramento, California. So he's on the other side of the country. And so he and his wife must have been visiting, and I just happened to be thinking about him and wishing I could handle that differently. And he manifests in front of me on the opposite side of the country. It was really, really bizarre. At the time, I just thought it was incredibly unlikely, and I was just taken by the odds. But of course, now I realize all of that's related. And again, one of the things that Sharon gets into in this book is that it doesn't necessarily have to manifest as these magical kind of things. It can just be that reality will take the path of least resistance, just like water does going down a hill. So in other words, you have this convergence where he and his wife did mean to come to Asheville to visit. It's a place people do like to visit. But it turns out that this happened at the same time I was thinking about this, wrestling with how we should have resolved things. Somehow reality is constructed in kind of a sacred geometry kind of way that you're talking about, in ways that all those things are accomplished in the best possible manner. So it was really, really fascinating. This relates to what I said earlier, that if we don't get it the first time, the second time, the 19th time, the opportunities will keep arising until we deal with it. And again, I think this speaks to the relational nature of reality, that, again, we take action, and then depending on whether or not we're kind of resolving some of that energy, things will reconfigure again to give us another opportunity to. So this speaks to a relational aspect of reality too, which is really fascinating.
And across life. Yeah. Okay.
And across lives. Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go into the next one. And there's a series of these that have to do with observer effects. So again, things that relate to indicators and implications of consciousness being primary. So the first one is entanglement. We've talked about this. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of quantum mechanics, perhaps the most fascinating, because it's the most glaring evidence pointing towards the fact that everything is actually one. So as we mentioned in the last episode, many of our ancient traditions, especially the Eastern cosmologies, assume this to be the case, that everything is absolutely one thing, and the manifestation into different independent things is basically illusory. Purposeful, but still illusory, ultimately, in terms of the ultimate nature of things. So what entanglement points to, as we said in the last episode, is the fact that when we change the orientation of one kind of thing, then it's entangled, as the word is used in quantum mechanics, with another particle. Those two will always be in sync with each other, no matter how far apart they are. So again, to give the example I gave before, one could be on one very edge of the cosmos and the other particle on the opposite edge. You change the orientation of one, the other changes immediately. Now, the example I've heard to describe this is you have this aquarium, and when you look straight on the aquarium, you see this fish swimming, and it looks like a certain fish. Then you take a different perspective, and you go to the far left, and you look at the rectangle of the aquarium from that side, you see another fish from a different perspective, and it moves too. And say if you have a camera, one at the front and one at the side of this aquarium, and you think you're looking at two different fish, but then you find, to your amazement, that when the fish in the front on camera moves, the side camera seems to take on an orientation suggesting that they are somehow linked, and you don't understand how this is the case. Of course, the answer is there really is only one fish. And of course, that makes sense that when it moves, you're going to see it evidenced in both cameras. So that's pointing to the nature of reality, which that's fascinating for two reasons. One, because it matches up with these ancient cosmologies. But number two, that in our experience, they do seem like two things, but fundamentally they're not, which tells us that what we experience of reality, again, is purposeful, is meaningful, I would say, for working out some of these energies we talked about. But ultimately, it's all one thing and just different modulations of the same underlying thing.
Yeah, I think it has a lot of implications for how we live our life, if you really get it. And we know that NHI, non-human intelligence, have said repeatedly to people, they feel sorry for us because we don't understand that we're all one. We're all fractals of the same thing. So our violence toward another is a violence towards self. And that is a core pinnacle concept in Buddhism and all the yogic traditions. The idea that everybody you encounter is a mirror of you. An interesting thing to go through the world, but that person that really annoys the yaha out of you daily, if you like, that person is a fractal with me. If you want to change the outside, you change the inside. It's a whole different way of working. I'll just say personally, having worked this principle now for quite a while in my life, I notice a lot more traction in terms of making things different in the outside world when I do use these principles of entanglement and say, all right, if I want that to change, I need to change my relationship to inside. I mean, it's a little micro, but I think it's a pretty interesting way people can play with the concepts in a way that's tangible.
Now, speaking of indicators of consciousness being primary, we also see this evidenced in different psi phenomena. For example, telepathy is a really well-known one. And of course, this stands out because, again, according to the physicalist model, there should be no communication other than using our usual senses. So how is it that people can communicate mind to mind? Now, on the one hand, we hear about this in the UFO phenomenon history in terms of the lore many, many times, probably the vast majority of times, these beings communicate to us by mind-to-mind communication. So when skeptics say, why would an alien from Alpha Centauri speak English or German or whatever, we say they don't. They somehow speak in a universal language that all conscious beings seem to understand, which again points to the fact that we're all connected somehow, I would say. But they do it in a mind-to-mind way. And furthermore, what's really interesting is that it's not just thoughts like structured together in linear form, like we form a sentence. It's actually what I call total presence telepathy, where the fullness of who they are across time is actually what is given across all in one go. Again, time seems irrelevant here. We would think that would take a certain amount of time to send that much, even if you have a really broad bandwidth you're downloading from. But no, it seems to be instantaneous, total knowledge of each other. And as I mentioned, I think in a recent episode, I can't remember which one it was now, which podcast, or maybe I just talked about one of my classes, but there's these 3 couples that took psychedelics and ended up having this really mind-blowing telepathic experience where they knew everything about each other intimately, which made it kind of awkward from then on in their relationships and their friendships because they each know each other totally, including not just their spouse. So this kind of points to what can happen. So again, what's fascinating here is that both the inner and outer interactions of conscious agents become available. And this speaks to telepathy, which tells us something about the fundamental nature of reality and the fact that all beings across space and time have something in common that allows us to interrelate.
Well, I also want to just add, it's really common. There have been studies of telepathy, and estimates range from like 10 to 30% of people reporting telepathic-like experiences. And when you include the broader range of psi experiences like precognition or clairvoyance or the various clairs that there are, with some surveys show up to 50% of people claiming at least one. And interestingly, the rates do tend to be higher in cultures with strong spiritual or mystical traditions. So in some studies in non-Western cultures show up to 60% of people having. So it's not an uncommon thing. You see it more commonly in twins. Lots of people say they believe in it. Over 40% of people say it to be true. And just kind of an interesting side note, it does look like gender matters. Females are a little more likely to report it, and younger people. It is a common experience that we all have. It again, though, often calls them this bucket of over there that I was saying is getting awful lofty.
Absolutely. And you made a great point that I meant to make, which is that it's not just NHI to human beings. It's not just telepathy happening there. It's being to being. It's human being to human being. And again, I've spoken before about Dean Radin. If people are really curious about this, maybe even a bit skeptical, get some of his books. Look into this. They've done rigorous research on this with really rigorous protocols to make sure there's no other way communication is happening. People literally can communicate through telepathy. It happens all the time. And again, to your point, even though we've been, again, propagandized around this notion of physicalism, that there's no ability for signals to be sent when there's no actual use of our voice or anything like that, we see all sorts of evidence for it, and people intuitively believe in it because we probably have all experienced it to some degree or another.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I bet most people listening can find an instance or two. And if you're really thinking about it more than that, and I would say, instead of writing it off, next time, be a scholar, study it. I think it is probably even more common than we imagine. I think we're probably doing it all the time. We write it off as, nonverbal signals, but I don't think so. So we should just start paying attention. The other place people can go is IONS, right? The Institute for Noetic Sciences has, which is Dean Madden is highly, I think you might have found it, but they've got a lot of research papers that are accessible right here, right now. You can just go read them.
Okay, now speaking of indicators that point towards this consciousness being fundamental kind of notion of reality, that again speak to idealism being a better fit for reality, another key data point we can point to that is demonstrable and points very much in this direction is psychedelics. This is another area of research that is very problematic for physicalists, for reductionistic materialists, because again, let's just make the point here that according to their model, any kind of conscious experience is the result of neurochemical activity in the brain. In other words, brain structures and the activity within them is what produces any kind of conscious experience. But this is where psychedelics pointedly are a problem, because when we look at brains of people having really, really vivid experiences on psychedelics, their brains look remarkably static and inactive. In other words, we do not see different parts of the brain lighting up. It looks surprisingly dormant, like not much is going on, while simultaneously people are having these absolutely mind-blowing experiences, very often described as the most mind-blowing experiences of their entire lives, full of vivid, visceral aesthetics. And of course, this doesn't line up, because if brain structures and neurochemical activity in the brain is causing conscious experience, how can it be that many, many people across the board report these really mind-blowing, extremely vivid experiences while the brain is simultaneously almost completely dormant? Again, this makes no sense from a physicalist model point of view. Now, furthermore, another point to make here is that not only are people having experiences while the brain seems dormant, but actually they're having experiences that seem more open-ended, more broadband, more expansive than their usual waking state reality. And that finding has led many researchers to conclude, or at least to lean towards the notion that actually what the physical brain is doing is acting more like a transducer. It's downloading and translating non-local consciousness, but not in a one-to-one way, but actually that our brain structures limit and filter what is actually available to us. And that when these brain structures are dormant, we actually experience more of reality. Indeed, we seem to expand into that reality, where we lose this hardline division between us and everyone else and everything else. Again, speaking to the porous nature of these boundaries and speaking to the fact that underlyingly, everything is one thing, and that's why we have access to everything, which we seem to experience on psychedelics. So just to make this point really clearly one more time, not only do we seem to be having conscious experiences of a very vivid nature while brain structures look completely dormant, but indeed we're having experiences that are more expansive than our usual waking state ones, which points to the fact that not only is the brain acting more like a transducer of non-local consciousness, in other words, therefore, consciousness isn't being produced by the brain, but just translated or downloaded the way a radio might stream radio waves and turn that into the experience of listening to a song, for instance, but that in so doing, our brains are also reducing the stream, limiting the stream so that we actually experience less of reality than we do when we are, for instance, on psychedelics or when we have near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, these matters we talked about last time. So again, this is fascinating. This definitely supports the notion of idealism and definitely supports the idea that consciousness is primary and not physicality.
I really want to jump into one of the topics I know is our absolute favorite, which is the Mandela effect. You and I have talked a lot about this, and we both find it utterly fascinating. So do you want to talk a little bit about what it is? And then I don't mind giving some examples.
The idea of the Mandela effect in general is that people, vast numbers of people sometimes, as a collective, seem to remember history that is no longer recorded according to conventional understanding. So when we look back at the paper record, for instance, or the internet record of what has happened in history, it no longer aligns with people's remembrance of what happened, which of course raises some serious questions. If it was one or two people, we would just say, well, this is what happens with memory. As you know, as a psychologist, we see all sorts of evidence that memory does change over time. Every time we access a memory, we're somehow modifying it a little bit. But that doesn't explain how mass numbers of people would remember a certain kind of event a certain way, and then now there's no record of this. So what this basically speaks to comes back again to the nature of reality, to consciousness, to idealism, the idea that basically physical reality is the manifestation of the collective mind. So when the collective mind begins to think differently about reality, reality begins to manifest differently. Now, what's different is that we're the first couple generations in history to have enough dedicated history to compare to go, wait a second, our felt sense, our remembered sense of what happened in our history no longer aligns with the historical record. What is going on here? And again, the idea is, and Jung talked about this as well, he suggested that physical reality was the other side of the coin of the collective unconscious, that the dynamics of the collective unconscious are what are mirrored in a manifestational way in physical reality. And when you have a mass shift in the collective, then you begin to see physical reality manifesting differently in many, many different ways. So maybe you can give us an example of some of the ones that people point to that seem really well attested.
Well, let's start with the one that it's named after. And I think it's really interesting. Somebody pointed this out, and I can't give them credit because I don't remember who it was, but they said that the first recorded episode of the Mandela effect was in 2009 when Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, which I remember. I remember Nelson Mandela died in prison. I was doing that. I was at the anti-apartheid movement at Berkeley then, and that was really trippy. I will say somebody noted that this first incident was not long after the CERN collider went online in Sweden, and they made some connection. Like maybe we started playing with quantum principles at a larger level and we modified things. Hard to say, but I think it's an interesting coincidence. Maybe synchronicity, who knows? So there's that, but there's some other really big ones that I wish I could see everybody's faces as we're talking about this and register who remembers what. Because one of the things about the Mandela effect that's very interesting is it's never more than two options. Like people remember either one way or the other. They don't remember it 5 different ways or 7 different ways. And if you, whatever way you remember it, they're all consistent, right? Whatever way you remember it, you really remember it that way. There's no question. Like I remember vividly in Star Wars, Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father." Right? Do you remember that? No, he doesn't say that in this reality. He says, "No, I am your father." No. There's so many examples I could give you, but the other one that really I was like, absolutely not, was Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. Remember that? Snow White, like a bazillion times. Yeah, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, who's the most beautiful of them all? Not here. It says magic mirror on the wall.
Okay, another couple ones before we move on to the next one is the Mr. Rogers theme song, right? So this one really got me. I was like convinced something's messed up here. And again, I want to point out that what some people argue, in light of what you said about there being 2 options, is that this might indicate a new timeline sort of splitting off from an old timeline. So we may have existed at one point in a timeline where C-3PO was all gold, and then somehow some event happened that collapsed reality in such a way that we entered a new timeline where it's different and it has always been different. Again, we don't really know what we mean by timeline. This gets into the complication of what is space and time and what are timelines, and are timelines even a thing? We don't exactly know. But we do know that there's these distinctions, these differences between memories and how it's recorded now. In the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood song, I remember it. It's a wonderful day in the neighborhood, right? It's apparently now, and it always has been, this neighborhood, which sounds absolutely wrong to me. It was never this neighborhood. It was always the neighborhood. So bizarre.
Wonderful day in the neighborhood. Exactly.
A couple other ones quickly, and I know this is one that you and I remember slightly differently, so perhaps we were in different timelines at one point. But I remember clearly Jiffy peanut butter, whereas of course now it's Jif, and apparently always has been Jif, but me along with a bunch of other people remember Jiffy. And the last one that again points to this is not necessarily just small things, is the very position of the continents on the Earth. Many, many people remember a very, very different arrangement of the continents than apparently is the case now, and it has been the case apparently for tens of thousands of years. So really, really perplexing evidence that seems to point to the fact that, yes, physical reality is not nearly as fixed as we think it is.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because you're right. There's 2 other examples that are pretty mind-blowing to me. Next Level Soul Guy interviewed a physicist from Berkeley who was talking a lot about this, and I recommend that episode to everybody. It's very interesting. But she said that in this reality, so when I was growing up, your heart was on the left-hand side underneath your ribcage, right? Put your hand over your heart. Apparently it's not. It's right in the middle of our ribcage. I went and looked it up, and it's in the middle, and it doesn't look right to me at all. Like there's nothing right looking about that. And then the other is, remember when we were kids, don't kick somebody in their back because you don't want to get their kidneys. Like there's the words about kidney punch. Well, apparently now in this reality, the kidneys are up underneath the rib cage, so you don't have to worry as much. Anyway, I think that was when I really blew a gasket, when I went and looked at the physiological records. I think this might be also underlying what the replication crisis that I referred to in the first episode in science, where even hard science findings, not soft science findings, are changing. The things that were replicated over and over, and now they're not replicable anymore. It would make sense if reality's iterating, right? If reality that we accord as the past is actually not quite the same as it was in our personal narrative, it would make sense. That would explain the replication crisis. But it would really freak out most scientists I know. So I don't know which they prefer.
Absolutely. That's the thing. Like, we are not just drawing from a couple shreds of evidence trying to convince people of something that's not very well supported. We're actually saying there's many, many different streams of data pointing in this direction. And again, people like Bernardo Kastrup have made the point that the only thing that's preventing us as a collective from embracing idealism as the notion where consciousness is primary is basically just the stubbornness of the pre-existing model, that paradigm has ruled for a long time and is not giving up easily. But eventually people do tend to gather around whatever best explains the evidence, and we're seeing more and more evidence pointing in this direction. All right, so to wrap up here, Janis, let's maybe just say a couple of things about what this means for how we might meet this unique moment in history. We titled this podcast Event Horizon because of the specific time we're in. Now, of course, if we live in a quantum world, a quantum cosmos, then challenges can also be opportunities, and everything is malleable. And reality itself, even when it feels overwhelming, when it feels daunting, is something that can be changed. And the only thing in our way of that change is the way we interact with it, the way we want to manifest reality. Of course, many people are blind to this process. Many people assume they have very little agency. But if we as a collective could wake up, we could have a massive change. It totally changes how you think about everything. One other piece I want to say before I pass it on to you for final thoughts is that I would also say that every problem has the answer within it already. And this is what I mean by tapping into holistic intelligence, because the idea is that everything is one thing. So if there's something that looks like a problem, it's actually just a perspective issue. You need to look at it differently. And because everything's connected, whatever is emerging as being looked at as a problem actually has a solution in the whole somehow. So I've used the example of sometimes if you're in a weather system and a tornado is coming your way, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like bad news. You can hone in on that specifically. But what we know is that basically a tornado is just the interrelation of different weather patterns, different high pressure, low pressure systems. And if you can understand it from that more broadband perspective, you can find the answer. So if we can embrace the fact that everything's connected and fundamentally change how we see ourselves, the planet, and all these other beings in this conscious cosmos, we can meet all these challenges. It's basically the main reason we're not meeting these challenges is not because they're intractable, but because we're looking at them from the wrong perspective.
Yeah, really good points. There's so much to say about this and the implications. This is one of the things I think about all the time and I'm constantly experimenting with. I think one of the sort of conceptual pieces that have been really helpful for me, although I don't know if everybody always follows it, is just that there's all design. If I can start to just even look at the synchronicities and the flow of my own life, I'm like, oh, I see it designed. Even when 8 synchronicities happen, somebody shows up, like the example you gave. Like I was talking to a friend the other day, somebody I haven't talked to in months and months and months. She asked me about another friend I haven't also talked to in months and months and months. That friend texted within 2 hours and said, hey, how are you doing? And I'm like, of course you would. Of course, because it is part of this wild design. Well, I think there's all these nested designs. So there is, I guess there's order in some ways that is really kind of fun to look for, and you can start looking for it in your own life. And then it does feel like this larger issue you brought up of what I think of as quantum activism. And I think I said this in the first episode too. I can't fight the big guys with guns and the power. But if reality is malleable, then we all have input. And what if we collaborate? What if we co-dream a new reality? I would venture to say that may be actually one of the most threatening acts. That may be one of the reasons why there's so much effort to keep us apart and afraid and stressed out, because the power of the collective at the quantum level, for the people who really know how this works, they know that it's really, really powerful, which I think is one of the reasons. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but certainly for me, one of the reasons to even be doing this podcast and to do any of the stuff that I'm doing and feel so drawn to do in my life right now is because there's some part of me that's like, I know that we can shift stuff. Can we shift it? You know, it's not like, yeah, I don't want to shoot the idea that I'm going to wake up tomorrow and it's going to be rainbows and unicorns. It's not like that. It's very fine work, like very fine needlepoint we're all doing together here. It takes time for things to build. But it gives me a lot of hope, and it gives me a sense of agency and direction. And then the last thing I'll say is that these days, I don't really feel like I'm exerting my will. I don't do that a lot. I really just listen and I watch the design and I try to get into alignment with it. And I think it's a much more peaceful way of living. I have to let go of some stuff, but it's also much more effective. I have found myself being able to flow through my life much more effectively. So those are just some of the high level implications for me in this time.
Great examples, and we will have future episodes where we dive into each of those. We will definitely get into more of the nuts and bolts of this, even if the nuts and bolts are kind of quantum. But that'll do it for this episode. We've explored a lot about the implications and the indications that we live in a reality that is fundamentally about consciousness, different modulations of consciousness, where even physicality is just an appearance that is ultimately just a modulation of the underlying consciousness. So that's going to do it for this week's episode of the podcast. We hope you'll tune in again in 2 weeks' time for Event Horizon.